Hi everyone, salut tout le monde. My name is Rick Smith and I'm the president of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. On behalf of our institute and our partners, welcome to today's webinar. Bienvenue à vous tous. Thanks for taking a little bit of time with us today. I'm zooming in today from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. And I want to also acknowledge that our nearly 400 participants on this call today are beaming in from places near and far, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Now, I was at COP26 in Glasgow, I'm sure along with many of you on this webinar last month. And one of the things that struck me was the way in which the climate discussion is now shaping areas of public policy from which it was previously disconnected. For example, just a few examples, the unveiling of a multi-billion dollar partnership between the US, the UK, France, Germany, and the EU to help South Africa finance a quicker transition away from burning coal for energy means that climate policy is now foreign aid policy. The fact that a new international coalition of the world's biggest financial companies has amassed up to 130 trillion US dollars, yes, that's trillion with a T, of private capital committed to hitting net zero emissions targets by 2050 means that climate change policy is now economic policy. And the agreement announced at COP26 between the EU and the US to work together to achieve the decarbonization of the global steel and aluminum industries, including through the use of focused tariffs, means that climate change policy is now trade policy. So we have an exceptional group of experts for you today to do a deep dive into this notion of climate policy as trade policy. And our focus is, of course, border carbon adjustments. So I hope you're ready for a great discussion, some great presentations, some great new data. Grab a coffee, settle back, get ready for some engaging discussion. For more information on this and other research that the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices does, please check out our website at climatechoices.ca. Now, it's my great pleasure, my honor, to introduce the German ambassador to Canada, Sabine Sparwasser, to begin our program. And I want to thank the German Embassy for their partnership today. Over to you, Ambassador, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rick. This is for us a wonderful partnership. We're very happy to be here. We're very grateful to your team, the CICC project team, all the panelists who are there, all the experts. I'm also excited that Catherine McKenna, who is the most dedicated and passionate politician that I know, an activist for fighting climate change, is going to be part of that. So wonderful to be amongst you. I think the timing couldn't be better for us here sort of in the German embassy to do this event. We just have a new government, and this new government has just started its job. It has written a coalition treaty that has climate change and fighting it absolutely front and center. On the 177 pages of the coalition agreement, there's not one page where climate change doesn't figure. And it's just as Rick just said, it transcends all the policy areas. We have included in our commitments now that we're going to be renewable energy on the electrical by 2030 with 80%. Our government has decided on enormous investment into renewable energy. It's going to put huge incentives towards industry and good compensation for citizens to actually transition our economy. We have carbon prices, and we're going to go much earlier than anticipated out of coal. So today, I want to quote you this. Our new Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, said in Parliament, "Behind us are 250 years in which we founded our prosperity on burning coal, oil, and gas. Now we have 23 years to get out of them, and out of them we will get. The greatest transformation of our industry and economy for at least 100 years is about to happen. So I think with this agenda, we do need to look at good ways of keeping our economies competitive, of good joint ways of avoiding carbon leakage within the EU and with very like-minded partners. And I can't think of a better partner with Canada. Now, Germany is going to take over the G7 presidency as of 1st of January, so in a few days, really. And this is going to be, the carbon adjustment is going to be a subject we are going to push there. Olaf Scholz has also proposed a climate club where carbon adjustment, again, will be a subject that we will talk about. I think we can learn a lot about today's webinar. We look forward to hearing all of you. Thank you for being our partners.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Hi, I'm Dave Sawyer. I'm the principal economist with Climate Choices. I'll give you a quick overview of our agenda and just give you a flavor of where we're going to go, and then I'll get going on my discussion. So I'm going to give about 10 minutes about some research we've been doing with the support of the German Embassy in Canada and the EU delegation in Canada, looking at cooperative approaches to border carbon adjustments. What do countries need to do together? Then we're going to go over to the Honourable Catherine McKenna, who will give us a nice overview, a unique perspective, I think, on border carbon adjustments, the trends in global carbon pricing, and how these deals get done. And then we're going to go over to Aaron Cosby and the other folks on the panel, and we're going to talk. Fortunately, we're going to actually get to listen to some of the leading experts on border carbon adjustment development in the world. And so, yeah, as Rick said, sit back and enjoy yourself. So you can put my slides up now if you don't mind. So border carbon adjustments, do countries even need to cooperate? When you think about these policies, the reason we implement border carbon adjustments is because of unilateral policy. One country is getting ahead of another. So they're sort of uncooperative to begin with, and that's the play on words for the title. But when you dig a little deeper into border carbon adjustments, you see some real areas of cooperation are needed and actually beneficial. So we're going to dive into those a little bit. Next slide, please. So if there's three takeaways that I'd like to give you from the presentation, and then you can sort of sit back and have a coffee and wait for the smarter folks at the end to give you the real insight. But I think one of the big lessons that I'm thinking about border carbon adjustments is that a global carbon price aligned across countries does not diminish the need for border carbon adjustments. So if we have a $30 global carbon price, that does not mean we don't need border carbon adjustments, because competitiveness is all about average costs. And there's all kinds of reasons why the marginal cost, the carbon price, would differ from the average cost of the policy, primarily because free allocations are given or compliance obligations are a small share of total emissions. And competitiveness is all about balance sheet impacts. And those are about average costs and not the marginal carbon price paid. So border carbon adjustments do not go away even if we get clubs that agree on marginal carbon prices. And I'm gonna, this is a really important takeaway, and I'll talk quite a bit about that as we go along. The second piece, you learn when you get into this literature is it's highly complex stuff, and the devil really is in the details. And there's a lot of learning that needs to go on. There's a lot of policy learning that needs to go on, and there's a lot of learning about relative programs, carbon pricing programs in countries, between countries, that needs to happen. And so even if you get down to brass tacks, as it were, and start to figure stuff out, you still have to sort of do the analysis and do the learning to figure out exactly what the relative carbon costs are between jurisdictions, and whether or not you can actually use detailed analysis to set really sort of precise measures about the level of the adjustment, or in fact you have to go to some other simplified message. And the last piece is sort of what do you get out of BCA, cooperative action on BCAs? Well, you get sort of smoothing the waters, as it were. So on design, there's a lot of design elements that are new. When you wade into the literature, these approaches have not necessarily been implemented to date. You can help out with competitiveness. You can reduce protectionism to the extent that you all sort of agree on some common design elements, and you've sort of been talking together for a little while about stuff. And finally, you can incent ambition both at home and away, to the extent that people want to avoid the border carbon adjustment, or you want to get more ambition domestically because you're dealing with competitiveness, and you can then, with a clear conscience, raise your effective carbon price, your average cost on industry, and raise ambition towards deeper targets. So next slide, please. So this is a bit of, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but and there's a lot of papers that Aaron and Suzanne and Michael have put together, among others, that really go into the details of border carbon adjustments. And this is all sort of scenario analysis because nobody's implementing this stuff yet in a big way. So it's a lot of what if analysis, and the what if and the choices you make put you in very different areas technically, I think legally from a trade perspective and administratively. So I won't go into great detail, but these are some of the sort of common design elements that we care about when we're doing border carbon adjustments. But basically, what's the scope? Who are we covering? Do we understand their emissions, their emission intensity? Do we understand our trading partners' emission intensity and the compliance costs they're imposing? How do these things fit in with international frameworks? How do we push them forward on the global stage or bilaterally? And finally, what are the governance frameworks that dictate these policies rolling forward, both our own governance, home country, and away? So there's lots there, but I think of this as a choose your own adventure sort of policy game. Next slide, please. So why would we cooperate on BCAs? And I sort of foreshadowed this a little bit, but I think best practices can smooth the water. So if you can basically figure out aligned, or if you can come to agreement on recommendations about design, then you understand what the other jurisdiction is doing, and it may help smooth the protectionist waters in that we're all doing very common, we're adopting common design elements, and maybe we've had a process to get to that sort of understanding. I think learning on policy alignment and learning is really important. The second point here, these large emitter systems are opaque and complex, and understanding their intricacies, understanding your own intricacies in Canada, what's going on in Alberta versus Nova Scotia, is hard. Then you throw in the EU, it gets really complex. So I think there's a real need here, especially given information asymmetries. We just don't have the data on the other industries. We don't necessarily understand how their benchmarks are set. We have to do a lot of work to figure it out. So don't underestimate the learning that's required to go along here. Maintaining competitiveness, this is all about applying appropriate levels of redress or adjustments on the exports coming in, but maybe not over protecting your own industry, because a goal or a principle of these instruments is really fairness across home and away markets. So that becomes really important to maintain competitiveness. So there's a reason to get your analysis right. Next slide, please. Administrative efficiency and reduce regulatory burden. I won't go into great detail there, but goods are moving across borders and there's forms to fill out, and so we have to sort of understand what's going on. So that's a very sort of simple benefit. Motivating countries to increase their own ambition and not outsource their policy. So one of the things in Canada we've done with the federal backstop carbon price, that's motivated a lot of provinces to implement their own policy because they didn't want to outsource to the federal government their policy. Same with BCAs. Why would I allow somebody to charge me, take my revenue, set the average cost of my own industry when I could do my own policy and drive it forward? So there's some sort of benefits there. And then this last one I talked about is creating political space in our home countries. I think this is a big one, right? Where competitiveness is a neurotic topic for industry, and politicians, their doors get kicked in by industry on a routine basis about competitiveness. So to the extent we can calm the waters, I think BCAs can help in a big way. Next slide, please. Almost done. So I think there are some concepts that we want to think about. Really, we want to focus on addressing leakage. So that says we need some analysis that look at the relative carbon prices and to look at the trade exposure, emission intensity in a detailed way of our facilities, and make sure that we're, basically aligning the costs with the instrument. So it's almost a principle, there should be no double charging is one sort of principle that's thrown around. you want to know what your own producers are paying and what they may pay in another jurisdiction under another system, so that you can understand the relative costs and then work towards equivalency. We really don't know this in Canada often, what compliance costs are in our large emitter programs. And we're going to have to start doing this on a unit cost basis, average cost basis, if BCAs are going to be successful. So this is our own homework we need to do. And then we want to talk about basically working with understanding the average costs in the other countries. And that's the cooperative bit. Hey, here's our average costs. Hey, those are your average costs. This is a product, you know, pulp and paper. Or pulp, how does this compare? What are the costs, relative costs? So there's a bunch of learning that has to go on there. And then governance is an important one as well. And I talked earlier about developing best practices, but also providing sort of appeal mechanisms and being transparent about the data you're using and the assumption you're using, so people can challenge, or, you know, so you know, the system just looks a little fairer and people can understand it. So there's some good governance aspects that have to go down. Next slide, please. So two initial areas of cooperation. And, you know, when you look at where the US, Canada, and the EU are, we have three very different approaches to, two approaches to carbon pricing, one approach to regulations, and unclear regulations at that, yet the border carbon adjustment somehow could work between the three. And I think boiling it down to unit costs really matter, and average costs. What are the average costs you're applying? So, these are the policy mechanisms are all very different. Adding the EU in, I'd really be interested to hear about the panel's thoughts on this. Sorry, adding the US in with implicit carbon costs, not from carbon pricing, raises a really interesting question about where's the boundary on the policy. Canada and the EU both have carbon pricing and complementary policies that are increasing average costs. If the US wants to use average costs from regulations as the basis of the charge, A, is it legal? Aaron, it'd be interesting for your panel to talk about that. But B, how do we even do that analysis? The carbon price is hard enough. And yeah, Canada's moving towards doing some consultations on the benchmarks. We have basically free allocations in our output-based pricing system in the form of benchmarks, and they act very similarly to the way the EU and, say, Quebec and Nova Scotia give out free allocations. So sorting that all out takes a little bit of time. Next slide, please. So, and then the second was assessing equivalency between the systems. And this is really about, initially about sort of the scope. So there's all kinds of questions here on scope, and I sort of talked about those earlier. But I think one of the really important questions for Canada, we have an economy-wide carbon price. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are covered. In the EU, scope 1 and 2 emissions are mostly covered, and there's no economy-wide carbon price. When we look at Alberta and the compliance costs in Alberta, the scope 2 and 3 emissions can double the scope 1 compliance costs. So scope 3 and economy-wide carbon price becomes really important for relative average costs. So I think this is sort of an area that needs a further look. And then the carbon content of goods, I mean, this is all over the literature. But again, I would make the extension that we need to know the emission intensity, but the emission intensity that's subject to the charge, the compliance cost. That's really what matters here, and the relative emission intensities. And there's all kinds of work that could go on there. And then to the extent you don't have the data and you default to a global value, you're into a bit of a mess, because people are, you're not getting the right intensity for the right facility, as it were, and you run into this problem of over or undercharging. And then finally, I mean, the paper that Aaron and Seton Stewart and Mike Bernstein put together really goes into the complexity of understanding emission intensities across these systems. So even if you have the same product, pulp, with a benchmark covering the same emissions in the EU and Canada, methodologies may mean that they're not comparable at all. So there's some real complexities here once you get into the sort of, we want to go into more detail on the emission intensities. So last slide, thank you. So, agenda moving forward, I think there's no surprise here. Governments need to continue to push it on the multilateral forums and also bilaterally. One of the thoughts I had is we really need, like in the Western Climate Initiative, these sort of clubby working groups where you parse out the administrative functions that need to be assessed, competitiveness, benchmarks, and then you come up over a 5-year process of recommended design features that then you see in the WCI today. And that was I was involved in that, a really, really interesting strategy. And at the end of the day, everybody sort of understood what was going on in the other jurisdiction, but also why they had chosen the certain design elements they did. And then finally, at the country level, I think it's really important. I talked about this quite a bit, but you have to know your own average costs. And we've done a poor job of this so far. It's really hard to get production data. Sometimes we have it, sometimes we don't. The regulators have it, provinces have it. But to do this properly, we need to start pulling that information and data together and engaging industry to get better data. And I think the BCA may force us in that direction. So I'll stop there, sort of whirlwind tour through there. I didn't want to eat up too much time. So now what I'll do is say thank you, and then I'll turn it over to the Honourable Catherine McKenna for a chat. And I don't think the Honourable Catherine McKenna needs an introduction other than to say the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Dave. I mean, what's there to say after Dave Sawyer speaks? I always call Dave for to get the lowdown on everything. Well, thanks very much. It's a snowy Wednesday here in Ottawa, slightly depressing, but here we are talking about border carbon adjustments. So we are the hardcore of the hardcore. There's nothing I care more about than climate change. So I certainly want to thank the Canadian Institute, but I also want to thank the German Embassy. I am someone who does spend almost all my time when I'm not chasing my children around thinking about climate change and how do we greatly increase ambition right now. When you talk about border carbon adjustments, I think you have to start with carbon pricing, as Dave pointed out. And I won't get into average cost versus marginal cost, although this is so critically important because I think sometimes we lose the plot. We talk about numbers, whether the price is $30 or going up to $170, that doesn't mean everyone's paying that. And that's not a bad thing because, maybe Canadians, if they found that out, they'd be like, wait a minute, why would some industries not be paying that amount? Because obviously competitiveness is a huge thing. When you look at what Canada's doing, and I'm proud of our ambition on pricing, I'm extremely proud that the pricing was upheld at the Supreme Court, that's for sure. We are ahead of many, many other countries. It's good to see in Europe prices going up. It's good to see that US talks about border carbon adjustments, but they don't have a price. Some jurisdictions do. So this is a very tricky topic, but it really matters. And it matters because competitiveness matters. It matters because we want to tackle climate change, but we also want to have industries in Canada and we want to have good jobs in Canada. So that's why pricing is important, average cost is important, marginal costs, and also being very thoughtful about border carbon adjustments. So I'm going to talk about really maybe about what I think about this, because I've been involved in this conversation internationally. At COP26 was part of a whole panel discussion on this. I was also part of a panel discussion on having a global price on carbon. And the Prime Minister has been out on this, but right now you have the IMF that's working very hard on this concept, and I'm very supportive because there may be a moment in time that you maybe are able to get a global price on carbon. And it's so critically important because I want us to be able to scale the investment in clean energy, and we need so much capital. And we need innovations, and we need people investing in those innovations, and we need them using the game-change technology that's available now, but it's expensive. So if you actually put a price, you're going to create the proper incentive for people to use things that are going to reduce emissions because they're going to pay less. Very basic concept. It's good that Ken is on the call or on this in this conversation. Ken Bosanquist has been very good as a conservative, understanding it's a market measure and talking about the importance of pricing. But when I think about this, border carbon adjustments, and actually my background is quite interesting. I'm a trade lawyer by training. So I really think it's time that climate and trade actually get matched together. But we have a challenge. So it's a challenge in Canada, as Dave pointed out, because we have different systems in Canada. So in a way, and I was talking to the IMF folks, and I was saying this, in a way, Canada's a good model because you can understand that it's not just saying, okay, there's going to be a price, and this is the price, because we have a price pollution across the board in Canada. But really, it's how much people are paying. And in particular, when it comes to industry, how many free allocations have been handed out? And as I say, it's not terrible that there might be free allocations because competitive is an issue, But if you're actually really going to drive down emissions, you want the price to, it has to increasingly rise, and it has to become significant enough that it's going to change behavior. So we've seen that it's very, very complicated. Now, Dave can spend a lot more time on this because he actually helps advise the government, I'm sure, on how to figure this out, these different systems that we have, the different allocations. We have a benchmark. We also have a backstop. And I was very, 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 very happy to see in the fall economic statement that the government says that they're going to tighten things. They're going to ratchet things up, and they're going to make sure that in a way we're taking away free allocation. The price has to go up when it comes to our output-based pricing system. But this brings me to the international piece. So we hear lots of people say border carbon adjustments. So number one, and I'm saying this wearing my trade hat, it has to be to address carbon leakage. It can't be a trade barrier. And that's actually a real concern because there are other things going on in the world, it may surprise you, that China, there's real concerns about China and India and other countries dumping steel and aluminum. So you may say, well, this is a good way to address this. We just bring in border carbon adjustment. It's not what it's supposed to be. It's about emissions. And it's not, it has to be real. It can't be something that isn't a real measure to address a real problem, which is climate change. You can't be dressing this up to address other issues because it's kind of handy. So I think that is going to be a real issue because folks are going to look at that, and you're going to see litigation in the you're going to see cases brought to the WTO 100% for sure in border carbon adjustments, assuming they're brought in. Two, this gets to the different systems. Well, the good news, Europe has a price. It's very different from how Canada does things. So we're going to have to figure out what is equivalency. But let's look at our southern neighbor. They don't have a price. Like, in fact, they're having a really hard time getting measures through. So I did pose this to my American friends. I was like, okay, border carbon adjustments. What exactly are you doing that you're going to say is equivalent? Because investing money, like big infrastructure programs on its own, that's not at all the same. That's not really what we're talking about. You need to have regulatory measures, and then you're going to have to look at the impact, and you're going to have to estimate, what's equivalent on this. And I worry because in politics, there's politics. And so, we've seen, and I'm speaking as a Canadian now, we've seen it's very hard with the US. I love the Americans. They're great, our best friends, neighbors, et cetera, except it's really hard right now. We've seen this on electric vehicles. But we don't want to get into a situation where we're all rah, border carbon adjustments. And then suddenly we've agreed to equivalency on measures that actually aren't equivalent. Why? Because that is very bad for our industry and competitiveness. Once again, I only care about climate change in a way, but I care about it in a way that's fair. And so I think that that's what we're going to have to really spend time doing. But I think this is also important. You can't let perfect be the enemy of good. And we actually saw that in terms of our pricing system. We knew that we were going to have to make adjustments. I'm no longer in government, but it was pretty clear when we brought the system in, it was actually only going to $50, that, you were going to have to do a lot of work, a lot of technical work. Then you were going to have to do more work, both in terms of equivalency, but also just in figuring out what was, what should be the marginal cost, or what allocations you should be giving, or how you should reflect that certain industries would be disproportionately impacted internationally because they export and their other places don't have a price. So I think that you do need to keep that in mind too, because you don't want to just hand it over to the technocrats. Dave, sorry, I think you're amazing, although you're very practical, but I think you also need to be practical. And so this gets to, so what do we do? I think this conversation is really important. I actually think border carbon adjustments are a good way to jam countries on price. So this IMF focus on major emitters, the US, China, India, and the EU, bringing them all together to get a minimum floor that would vary by country. The border carbon adjustments, the threat of that may actually create some impetus. But as Dave says, they're not, you can't just do one without the other. So I think we're going to have to be practical, but this is going to take some work. It is also going to require politicians to care and actually not give people free passes or get out of jail free cards, but actually making sure that, we're looking at the impact on our industry, but also being pragmatic and actually getting things done. And I do like clubs. So this would be a club. We're obviously not the whole world is going to be part of the Border Carbon Adjustment Club. I guess everyone could do it independently. But I think that there's a huge opportunity. I think we need more conversations like this. I like the fact that we have people that are ex-politicians like me, and then we have people across party lines, but also folks like Dave who have been really amazing and really in the weeds and in understanding how to do this.
It falls to me to thank you for those framing remarks. I should say that, in terms of setting the context for us between what you've given us and what Dave has given us, I feel like we've already been through an entire session. But there is more to come. And so, yes, thank you for that. We're now shifting gears. We're going to go into a panel discussion. And as Dave has promised, we have some panelists on this session, which are going to, they're among the brightest stars on this issue in the world. Before we get there, a couple of words of housekeeping. Following the panelists' interventions, we'll try to set, if the panelists are disciplined, we will have a few minutes for questions and answers. And you can submit questions. If you take yourself off full screen view, you'll see at the bottom right-hand side of your screen a question button, and you can use that to submit questions. If they're really good questions, we'll pose them to the panelists and try to get some more of an interactive session going at the end of the panel discussion. Let me abuse my position as the moderator of that panel discussion by further setting the context for our discussions and go all the way back to rising global ambition on climate change. And Rick Smith at the start talked about the incremental increases in climate change ambition that we saw at COP26, both in the terms of nationally determined contributions and in terms of the panoply of partnership initiatives and joint programs and pledges that went on as a sideshow to the negotiations themselves. We're now approaching something like 90% of emissions globally under a net zero target, comprising countries with 90% of global GDP. Over 30 countries have put those ambitions into law. So we're seeing a tangible move toward climate ambition and meaningful climate ambition as befits the nature of the climate emergency. Why is that important context for this discussion? Let's take Canada's case. We have a legislated target climate price or carbon price of going up to $170 a ton by 2030. Of course, that's a marginal price. We won't go into the weeds on that, but it's a set price, and it applies both to fuels and to emissions intensive trade exposed sectors, who amongst them are responsible for fully 1/3 of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. There is no way we can address that third of Canada's emissions without, as Catherine McKenna properly put it, making them feel the full effects or the unmuted effects of a carbon price. And that ambition, if it is going to translate into decarbonization as opposed to deindustrialization, needs some kind of protection. Now, at present, we're doing that through output-based allocation, but again, that is not going to get us out to a net zero future. It has to fall. The covered industries need the incentives to actually make investments in innovative technologies, disruptive technologies, and they won't get it without a full carbon price. There is the alternative of a global carbon price. So we have the Kumbaya solution, where if we all joined hands and sung from the same carbon price playbook, we wouldn't need border carbon adjustments. But I think while that is entirely laudable, and I think we need to be working toward greater cooperation on carbon pricing internationally, I don't think it's going to happen at the speed or the comprehensiveness necessary to make us avoid putting in place border carbon adjustment or some means to protect against competitiveness and leakage problems. So that is why we're here talking about border carbon adjustment. In the context of the kind of ambition that we have, we need some form of solution to the problem of potential leakage, potential competitiveness impacts. The EU has been thinking about these things longer than we have for at least a few years. In fact, they've put in place, as we're going to hear later in the panel, a proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, propelled by, again, the fact that their ambition is high. The EU Green Deal involves a 55% reduction in emissions over a 1990 level by 2030. This is highly ambitious. And of course, they're thinking about what this means for their energy intensive trade exposed sectors. Others will walk that same path as ambition rolls out. They will have to. Those numbers are roughly similar in so many OECD economies. So we're here to consider not only Canada's challenge in achieving its ambition and the ways in which we could make that work, but also the ways in which we could imagine similarly ambitious countries facing those same problems, cooperating. And Dave foreshadowed some of the nature of that cooperation in his framing remarks. Are there ways in which the jurisdictions that are considering BCA might cooperate internationally in ways that make BCA more politically viable, less trade impactful, more administratively feasible, ultimately more effective? So we'll get into all of that. And I'll stop abusing my position as moderator and bring us to the actual experts in this show. We have a good cast. I'll introduce them each as I bring them on. We'll start with Marie-France Paquet, who is the Chief Economist at Global Affairs Canada. Marie-France, can you give us some framing for Canada's position on BCAs? I know Canada doesn't have an official position yet. We're in consultations, so we're not going to ask you for details in that nature. But why is Canada considering doing this? Where are we at in terms of process and substance in Canada on border carbon adjustments?
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you for the invitation. Let me start by a disclaimer so we adjust expectation. I am no specialist on carbon border adjustment, right? I come at this question, as you said, Aaron, in my position as Chief Economist at Global Affairs. And just allow me for a second. So when I think about climate change, of course, in my view, you can't talk about climate change these days without talking about international trade. I think Rick said it in his introductory remark, climate change is policy is now economic and trade policy, right? So in my position, so very often we're called upon to assess potential economic impacts of free trade agreements. We do this when we launch negotiation, we do this at the end of a negotiation, once we have a text, a final text, and we reevaluate potential impacts. We do the same on the environmental impacts. So once we have a trade agreement in place, we say what could be the potential impact on the environment. So in this case, of course, we recognize, and I think everybody will, right, that no country can address all environmental issues through trade, right? Agreements alone, bilateral or plurilateral, that won't do it. It will be probably a domestic measures, CBAM probably as well, and other measures in place that will be needed. So trade in and of itself won't do it either. So, and again, today, I'm not going to talk about or those things like complying with WTO or other trade agreements or things like that, right? I just want to highlight a few, what I think important point about, what is, in our view, the way forward, which is, of course, CBAM are a great tool, and cooperation is absolutely a must. So some countries have already announced their intention, and it was mentioned that the European Union is the most advanced in its work. They've been working on that for quite some time. And of course, Canada has signaled its interest in developing a CBAM, looking into it. Consultations were on the way, but of course had been suspended because of the election period. So that will resume shortly if it hasn't already. But we came at this actually because of the EU Green Deal, announcing their big ambitions and the fact that they wanted to put a CBAM in place for some select sectors. So at the time, when you think back, that was the fall of 2019, before the pandemic, once upon a time, and not a lot of details were available yet, right? But we started asking, we got questions saying, would that erode Canada's preferential access to the EU market, right? We just gained preferential access under CETA, provisional application since September 2017. What about that plan of the EU, right? So of course, we embarked with our colleagues from Environment and Climate Change Canada to evaluate those potential impacts. So we had to go back to Brussels, ask a few more questions as they were themselves kind of developing their position and more details were becoming available. So what we've done basically is look at their what they wanted to do, how they wanted to apply the CBAM. And we said, okay, if they apply this, so of course it has an impact in terms of putting a tariff on imports from the outside the EU, and Canada would be caught in the net. And for Canada, what it would mean is we calculated about a tariff equivalent of 0.54% for the sectors that are currently covered in the EU emission trading system, okay? So 0.54% on average, right? You can say, it's not high, but it is actually larger than what would apply to the United States at 0.49, Australia 0.41, and Japan 0.46. 14th. So we would definitely be at a disadvantage there in the EU market. And it would, of course, ensue that Canada's export could decline by 0.5% by 2030. Okay, so that's the first thing. So at face value, not so great. But here's the good point, is if actually the CBAM was instead based on difference in carbon prices between countries, so Canada's export would face a tariff equivalent of 0.15%. So going from 0.54 to 0.15%. So about 70% lower than a full CBAM. Okay, so if they were to take into account what Canada has put in place, that would reduce significantly the impact on Canada's export into the EU market. And under that scenario, export could go up by 0.4% by 2030. Okay, so of course, it's 0.54, 0.55. It's not the point. The point is, if you take into account what we already have as a system in Canada, it would, and that would be internalized, so to speak, then of course the impact on Canada's export into the EU would be significantly lower. Okay, and the morale of the l'histoire in this particular case, right, is that we were able to do this by, keeping a dialogue open with the EU, asking questions, and as they were kind of developing their own, refining their scenarios and the potential and whatnot, then we were able to take that into account and keep on informing them. So the two-way dialogue is, of course, very important. And then we went from there, Canada, EU, and thinking, right, other countries have announced that they might do the same. And we said, okay, what if Canada imposed a CBAM as well? Okay, so what we use is our typical in-house computable general equilibrium model. We run some hypothetical scenarios, lots of assumptions have to be made. There's lack of data that was already mentioned. It is a national model, not provincial, right? We look at scope 1 and so on and so forth. Lots of assumptions need to be made. But the first scenario we ran is simply to look and say, if Canada goes along with a CBAM, with the EU, taking for granted they're going to have something in place, and we put measures on everything else, what would be the results? And what, in the second scenario, what if Canada, Mexico, and the US in North America would do it, and the EU would have their system as well? So that would be the club. US, Mexico, let's say, and EU together, what would be the result? And of course, you're not going to be surprised to hear me say that CBAMs are effective in reducing global emissions, right? Even if Canada were to go along with the EU, it would have a good, significant impact, if you will. But if we go at it together, the impact is much better, much stronger in terms of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. And it can actually make a much more sense from an economic standpoint. Okay, so that's not a surprise because, of course, kind of US trade would expand under a certain scenario with a bigger club with the US and Mexico, because we would be replacing lost imports in the US market from countries outside the club, right? So you can look around and say, okay, there's some minor changes on GDP gains if we go with the club approach, so to speak, right? Compared to a very small decrease if Canada goes alone. That's GDP-wise, okay? But the main point, I think, is to recognize that, and that's important. It's like working together causes increased trading activity between the involved countries, right? The people in the club, definitely. But it also can increase higher production and increase production and emission in participating countries. But these would be taxed emissions that are replacing untaxed emission imported from countries outside the club. Okay, and in that scenario, of course, we don't have any cap and trade system. It's just a CBAM in place. Okay, so if we go at it together versus go at it alone, Canada and the EU, let's say we go from reducing, 2 megatons of greenhouse gas emission globally to reducing by 60 globally if we go as a club. Okay, so it multiplied by 30. So this idea of doing it together, of course, has a much bigger impact overall. But you need to look at the trade diversion and all the changes in terms of exports and imports, the trade patterns while you do it, because as I said, the domestic, there could be an increase in domestic emissions because of replacement of different imports, so changes in trade patterns, okay? So for us, of course, we really believe that we need to do this together. If countries are serious about reaching their climate objectives, and I hope they are, right? While at the same time trying to minimize impacts on the economy and trade, then cooperation is absolutely the key. Yes, countries will have different CBAM, they will apply differently. Countries can decide to go with different system, regulatory in nature, and then you have the question of equivalency that was mentioned earlier, or do different things in conjunction with a CBAM. But it means that information sharing, mutual recognition, equivalency where and when it is possible will be key ingredients for collective success of reaching our climate target. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marie-France, for that great, it gives us a picture, a sort of a tangible feel for the kinds of cooperation we could imagine across countries when we talk about the negotiations between, or the discussions between Canada and the EU as Canada considers its options on border carbon adjustment. I note that you talk about a climate club within North America, and I also note that Catherine McKenna asked what an actual border carbon adjustment might look like in the US in the absence of a carbon pricing regime. Anyway, I expect we'll come back to that in discussions. I want to turn to our next speaker, but before I do that, I've been reminded that in typical fashion, I have forgotten to introduce myself. I'm Aaron Cosby. I'm a senior associate with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It's a Canadian non-for-profit think tank based in Winnipeg, but with offices in Ottawa and internationally. We work on a number of issues, including border carbon adjustment. Let me turn now to our next speaker, Ken Boesenkol, who's a lecturer at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. Ken, can I ask you, staying with Canada for the moment, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in the Canadian context? And you and I have discussed this, putting in place border carbon adjustment, given our diversity of provincial approaches and the federal backstop that presumably has an equivalency effect on them. Take us into the weeds on that particular question, if you would.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to the organizers. Also, thanks to Minister McKenna for her kind words about some of my work in this area. I will return the favor and say that on carbon pricing, she also has done a tremendous amount of good work for Canada on this front. But let me pick up a couple of throwaway lines that Dave Sawyer and Catherine McKenna sort of threw out, and let me reorder them and draw some draw some conclusions. Canada's carbon pricing policy, as we know, has developed from the bottom up. And I think this has not only been necessary, but it's been good. As the Eco-Fiscal Commission said in its first sort of groundbreaking report, Canada's provinces have very different industrial structures. Canada's provinces have very different carbon footprints. And so it's not surprising that the evolution of carbon pricing across Canada has been different in different provinces. And speaking as an Albertan, I would also add that if we had a national carbon price, the amount of money that would leave Alberta into Ottawa and the amount of money that would presumably come back into Alberta from Ottawa would cause some, what word should I use, consternation at both ends of that spectrum, just due to the sheer size of those cash transfers. Carbon pricing policy province is something that I think, as I said already, it's not only necessary, but it's a good thing. But this raises three challenges for border carbon adjustment. And I want to thank Aaron for teaching me so much about this. We're trying to write a joint paper together that I think will come out in the next few months, and I've learned a tremendous amount from him. But I want to assume that everything I'm going to say he'll agree with. But let me say there are three challenges with the provincial approach to carbon pricing that emerge. The first one is that the effective carbon price across our provinces is not the same. We have a carbon price in Quebec, an effective carbon price in Quebec that is not necessarily the same as the other provinces. Despite Minister McKenna's best efforts to name a national carbon price, you have a very different regime in Quebec than the rest of the country. And I realize these prices have been converging toward each other, but they don't necessarily have to do so. So the challenge number one is we don't have a single national carbon price. Challenge number two is that each province has addressed the competitiveness issues, but they've done so in different ways. So in Alberta, we had the development of an offset-based allocation by the Notley government, has been largely retained, although somewhat changed by the Kenney government. In British Columbia, we have a more sector-by-sector approach, sort of an application-based approach. Whereas the province of Quebec, they give out free emissions units. And the feds have sort of plopped on top of that its own offset-based allocation, which originally mirrored Alberta's, but has some differences, for example, on electricity and a few other things. And so you have these different provincial regimes dealing with competitiveness, and that will be a challenge when you want to put on top of that a single national border carbon adjustment. And these problems get exacerbated as you move from 30 to 50 to $170. The third challenge that I would raise is that some provinces, and particularly my own province of Alberta, have started to use these offset-based allocations for policy purposes, for domestic policy purposes. So you have the OBA dealing with the oil sands in its situ and other methods. The treatment is slightly different. And they're different because the Alberta government wants to achieve some policy objectives. And if you move to a BCA regime run presumably by the national government, Alberta may or could lose this policy flexibility. And in the Canadian Constitution, it says provinces have the ability to control natural resources. And I think, again, this will cause some challenges with the development of a BCA, a single national border carbon adjustment, if that's what you want to have, when Alberta is using its offset-based allocation system to do some domestic policy stuff. So I think the solution in theory is actually really simple. We just need a single national carbon tax, and then we start treating the border carbon adjustments like we do with the HST and GST, and it's all very straightforward. But as I think I've tried to say since I started talking, that's not going to happen in Canada anytime soon. So what's the solution in practice? Do we have the provinces lead the negotiations? What's the role of the provinces versus the federal government in talking about border carbon adjustments? Can we have a single national border carbon adjustment when our carbon taxing regimes across provinces are so different? And I don't know what the answer to that question is. As I think Aaron and I are put in a paper, this is difficult but not impossible to solve, but I lean to the difficult and I think he leans to the not impossible. And we'll see where it goes. And I haven't even started at this point talking about all these complementary policies. And if the US is going to use other things, non-carbon tax regimes to develop a border carbon adjustment, what about all of the other policies in Canada that exist at the provincial and the federal level to deal with these things? How are we going to address that in a world where the United States says subsidies for electric vehicles, we need a border carbon adjustment for that? How do we calculate it? How do we do it? How do we add that to our carbon price? All of which I want to conclude by saying this is going to be tough. Thank you.
Those are great closing words. Thanks, Ken. I think it brings to mind the draft title of the research report that IST worked on border carbon adjustments in Canada, the working title of which I suggested should be Down the Rabbit Hole, or maybe more appropriately, down the various rabbit holes. The more you try to apply this instrument in the context of specific carbon pricing regimes in different jurisdictions, and to different sectoral realities within those jurisdictions, the more you understand that this is not an easy task. But thanks for that glimpse into the realities of the Canadian system and how BCA might apply to it. Let's move more internationally now. It gives me great pleasure to come to our next speaker, Susanne Troge, who's a senior fellow in the Global Issues Division of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the, if I might, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. I don't know how close I got there. Susanne, you've been an astute observer of the European developments on CBAM, and before that on border carbon adjustment more generally. We go back many years on this. Can you give us a brief overview of what's going on in the EU with respect to the CBAM? And I would be really interested to hear about the proposal from Chancellor Olaf Scholz on German climate clubs, because of course this is relevant to our discussions in terms of international cooperation on issues like BCA.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Aaron, and many thanks for having me. Greetings from Berlin, late in the evening. I'm trying to give you a short overview of what's going on with the EU plans for a CBAM and then turn to the club idea. And as you may be aware of, the EU has a big agenda, the so-called Green Deal, and the entry point really is the increased ambition on reduction for emissions by 2030. Now 55% is the new target that is already put into law in the climate law at the European level, and climate neutrality by 2050. So this first chunk of the legislative package was released in July, and the second one by accident today. And in the first legislative package, the Fit for 5 Part 1 package, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is a standalone proposal that is but closely attached to the European Emissions Trading Scheme that is also now being reformed and extended to more sectors. The idea of placing border carbon adjustment as a tool against carbon leakage is an old one, as Aaron and several other speakers have mentioned before. It goes back to 2007 already, because the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, came in phases. It's a new legislation, renewed and renovated legislation in several periods. It has been under discussion how to reform it, and the latest approach was taken in 2017 on including in the ETS proposal legislation cement, import cement, so a border adjustment for cement, and it didn't get anywhere. So everybody thought this is a dead horse, don't ride it. But well, things have changed a lot. So we are talking today about a proposal that is actually a separate legislation on a border adjustment. And we are now in the phase where the comments and opinions are being drafted by the legislators, including the European Parliament, which is a key player in the game. So for the new ambitions, the European Emissions Trading Scheme will take over more than 60% if the proposal goes through of the emission reductions, and that will mean an increasing carbon price. And the price is really high. It's hiking a lot, and it's around 80 euros by now. So everybody's really getting kind of into it. We don't know how much volatility and speculation is in there, but I guess it is a lot. And now the markets test even the 100 euros per ton price. But the signal is clear. There will be a high price, so the risk of leakage, competitiveness challenges will increase. And so the adjustment of costs at the border is a new kid in town, because an decreasing cap with a decreasing share of free allowances will end with nearly no free allowances anymore. And also the current legislation says we won't have free allocation by 2030 anymore. So this will open up a new component, a new portfolio to address carbon leakage. And what does it look like? Well, first and foremost, I must say that in the drafting, it was interesting to see how much internally, in looking to the inside of the needs of the EU, this drafting took place, and not much was, there was not much dealing with international ramifications, although, as Aaron has mentioned, many observers said, hello, there's a world out there. Maybe you want to talk to your trade partners about introducing such a charge at the border. This is gaining space right now, and I think in order to understand why the EU is so clear on it, there are many things that were driving the process. One was, how do we replace free allocation? What are the interests of the industries? How could we test this kind of model? Nobody has done it before. And of course, how could that be brought in line with WTO rules? And the whole proposal reads really clearly, being so including all the principles that have to obey to not undermine the multilateral trade system. And the proposal is supposed to start a system without any payments in 2023 for 2 years, so collecting data on foreign production emissions, only the direct emissions for 5 sectors: steel, aluminum, cement, some fertilizer products, and electricity from neighboring countries. Then, of course, the point is that a CO2 price from a tax or from a system like the ETS will be credited for in the future. And for a phase of 10 years, there should be a phase out of free allowances by 10% each year and a phase in of the CBAM. So that would mean a full CBAM from the point of view of today's proposal would kick in only by 2036. So 12 years of testing and trying to bring that system up and running. And of course, there is a review foreseen for the boundaries, for the sectors, and also for including indirect emissions. The overall impression, as said, is that this is a very tight drafted proposal, tightly drafted when it comes to most favored nation treatment and national treatment, no double pricing, and so no discrimination of farm products. Well, what the next steps, as said, will be that there are now opinion being drafted, and by April, the European Parliament is planning to hand in its opinion and decide on all the other packages, the parts of the packages as well. And then the trialogue will start where the legislators, the member states, the Commission, and the EP will come to terms to decide on this proposal. Maybe I want to, let me turn to the big picture here. We were talking about cooperation already and the interest and complications. And I find it very interesting that Marie-France already addressed the effects, the potential effects of the CBAM for the sectors covered. One is that I put down myself as well, is that of course the suppliers to the EU will be put in a completely different competitive setting by the impact it will create for on the goods imported, so on the price of the goods imported. That is interesting. I think also that some trade partners started to move on their own plans, and we are really now in the moment geopolitically where the EU is struggling a lot with its eastern neighbors. You know about the geopolitics about the Ukraine, and Ukraine is a country that is delivering many of the products to the EU, but also so is Russia and Turkey, and we are really busy sorting out their reactions to the plans, while of course US and China are critical partners or competitors on this subject. And I think so far we clearly see that the US is the driver of how the EU is able to position its plans, because so far we all think here, at least in my bubble, that the EU will not be able to go it alone. It needs partners. And that brings me to the last point, the club idea. The now Chancellor, but former finance minister, has identified the carbon clubs or climate clubs, now called alliances, as one project that he could drive forward. And he started that as a finance minister, and now you can bet that his Sherpa for the G7 will bring it to the G7. And what does it include? Well, it is the idea so far, and that went to the old cabinet, is to have an alliance project that brings forward implementation of climate policy among the countries that are willing to do so, that are ambitious. And it is supposed to be bold when it comes to alignment of the measures to address CO2, like pricing, but also and carbon leakage, but also industrial decarbonization. So it could include hydrogen projects or whatever have you. And it is supposed to be cooperative, which is a bit of a contradictory thing right now, because a club or an alliance could be very exclusive, but the signal here is we want to be inclusive as well. And this is a lot of talking about preventing the disadvantages for partners, potential partners out there who would really would like to be part of this, but cannot do so immediately and need some time. And I think this is interesting because trade policy comes in, and also finance and technology transfer. So it's a bit of everything. And I think as the G7 is already a club, at the moment at least politically, it's a club of the willing to bring forward climate policy. I think we will see more debate on how to handle this in the context of the US plans, and also of course the Canadian plans. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. That was a masterfully short summary of the history and details of the current CBAM, and thrown in a description of the German Climate Club proposal. So I think it sets us up well for our last speaker, Michael Melling, an old friend and colleague. Michael is the Deputy Director at the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. And while Michael, I'm not going to ask you to speak on behalf of the US, even though you're sitting in the United States, that would be entirely unfair. I'm hoping that you can explore, we've had up to this point references to the idea of the difficulties of cooperating with the United States if they don't have a carbon price, and the curiosity expressed by Catherine McKenna about what the US has in mind when they talk about a BCA. So perhaps you could run through for us some of the US proposals that we've seen that look like they might be aimed at carbon pricing or border carbon adjustment. And if you could touch also on the recent bilateral agreement between the US and the EU on steel and aluminum. Rick Smith noted this in his opening remarks. And I feel like I'm throwing a steak to a lion here. Give it a critical appraisal.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Second panel we're both on today. It never gets old. Thanks very much to the organizers, of course, for inviting Dave in particular. I appreciate the opportunity. This has been a great debate so far, and I'll try to sort of look a little bit into the past to catch us up where the US stands on border carbon adjustment. There's plenty of questions, of course. You know, it's interesting, like in the EU, where mid-2000s saw an initial surge in debates about border carbon adjustments. The French government in particular introduced it in the EU. We've had the same thing in the US. So an op-ed by a head of a labor union and the head of a large utility kind of got this discussion started in 2007, and pretty much every major federal climate bill that was introduced on Capitol Hill after that, including the Waxman-Markey bill that passed the House, but then had a not so successful fate in the Senate in 2009 and 10, had an international reserve allowance program, so clearly a BCA. And over the last decade, a number of additional bipartisan or partisan carbon tax proposals mention a BCA, but we've also had proposals elsewhere. The Baker-Schultz bipartisan carbon fee and dividend plan that this nonprofit, the Climate Leadership Council, has proposed, the Green New Deal resolution that Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got passed by the House of Representatives in 2019, a very sort of vaguely described import, tariff of some sorts. So I think looking into the past, it's a pretty safe bet that border adjustments would again be part of federal climate policy discussions after the 2020 election. And indeed, already on his campaign trail, Joe Biden mentioned climate tariffs in his Biden climate plan, although again, very, very vague. After the new administration took office, the sort of most concrete thing we've heard out of Washington has been the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai's 2021 trade policy agenda. But again, it only mentions the need to explore this instrument. It doesn't set out any further details. And frankly, when it comes to the White House and the executive branch, it's really not entirely clear how they position themselves. There's been, ambivalent in the gossip columns and in the Capitol Hill press, et cetera. It's a bit ambivalent. There's concern about consumer price impacts, not quite sure what it would be legally and so on. So it's been ambivalent. Not so much on the Hill. So already also in summer, around the time that the EU is ready to launch its CBAM regulation proposal, the Democratic leadership in the Senate circulated a memorandum that suggested that a carbon polluter import fee could be part of a source of revenue, so an offset in the fiscal year 2022 budget resolution. Now we know that that's all stuck as part of the Build Back Better plan, the huge investment plan that's supposed to go through budget reconciliation. But one example of what could be dropped into that, if indeed the discussion moves forward, which is unclear as yet, would be a bill that was introduced on Capitol Hill in mid-July, just a few days after the the Commission released its proposal, by Senator Coons of Delaware and Representative Peters of California, which they called the Fair, Affordable, Innovative, and Resilient Transition and Competition Act, or the Fair Transition Competition Act. And this is interesting because it indeed has to navigate the fact that there is no, and they don't expect there to be, a federal carbon price in the US. It would cover similar products as the CBAM, iron, steel, aluminum, cement, any products composed of more than 50% of those upstream products, as well as the upstream, so the production emissions of most types of fossil fuels. And the scope could be expanded by the Secretary of the Treasury. So this would be very much in the hands of the Treasury. And interestingly, so the Treasury would have to navigate that absence of a federal carbon price by calculating what they call the domestic environmental costs incurred by US businesses under a suite of different federal and state climate policies, and of course, most of those not being explicit pricing policies. The Department of Treasury would also have the responsibility to come up with methodologies to determine the production greenhouse gas emissions of imports, so the carbon intensity of imports. And with those two variables, these domestic environmental costs incurred and the production greenhouse gas emissions, they could then, of course, calculate a fee to be applied to imported goods. There would be some exemptions, LDCs, but also countries whose laws and regulations are at least as ambitious as US federal laws, and who do not impose a border carbon adjustment on US goods, which then, if you interpret that literally, would mean that the EU would still be hit, even though they have a domestic carbon pricing system and very ambitious climate policy. The last 30 seconds, 1 minute, I want to briefly touch on that partnership proposal that you mentioned. So on October 31st, the first day of COP26, which was kind of interesting because it stole the show a little bit, the US and the EU released a joint US-EU statement on trade in steel and aluminum. And the way it's described in a relatively vague and sort of short programmatic statement, if you like, is it's a commitment to negotiate what's called there the world's first carbon-based sectoral arrangement on steel and aluminum trade by 2024. So over a 2-year period. And the objectives described in there are very much to confront the threats of climate change and global market distortion. There's not much in terms of details. One of the few things that's mentioned in that statement is that they would set up technical working group to look at how to share data on developing a common methodology for assessing embedded emissions, et cetera, which is good, I think. But to come back to what Minister McKenna said before, with its focus on also trying to solve the restoration of market orientation, very much geared, of course, towards trying to block exports from China, so imports into the EU and US of dumped steel from China and other non-market economies. Of course, it opens the door to protectionism, or what I very much like to call, trying to dress up one thing, a sensible thing, with a lot of other stuff, because it comes in handy to try to cover all these different objectives with one measure. So I think that takes us already to the discussion then of how can one cooperate and how does one avoid risks of naked green protectionism. Back to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Michael. That's a good summary, a critical summary of the issues at play. Well, I want to throw a few questions to the panel. In the time we have left, we have had a few come in. Let me start with a question from a participant named Evan, who asked about the starting point of the question was the WTO legal status of any border carbon adjustment scheme. Now, I don't think we could have an entire session on this, but the question went from there to say, are there ways in which pursuing border carbon adjustment bilaterally or multilaterally might reduce the risk of a breach of WTO obligations? And let me throw out to the panelists this question, and let me frame it with the background of the OECD proposal, or purported OECD proposal, that global carbon pricing be run through the OECD, and that it be a cooperative approach of that kind, a multilateral approach, or at least plurilateral approach, and that it consider, in order to bring in countries like the United States and Australia that don't have a carbon price, that it consider non-price-based carbon policies to be part of its determination of equivalent ambition, and as part of its border carbon adjustment at the border. And this gets to the types of initiatives we contemplate in the Coons-Peters Act. What are we, if we act on a multilateral basis like that? Question number one, does that reduce our WTO risk in doing so? And are there fundamental challenges to the kinds of proposals that Coons and Peters put forward in determining the equivalent carbon price at the border for non-price-based policies? This is obviously an important question for Canada. Ideally, we'd go in lockstep with our southern partners on this stuff. Is there anybody that would like to step in to address that loosely phrased bundle of questions? Minister McKenna, please feel free to come back in if you have thoughts on this as well. Oh, please.
All right, and I'll keep it brief because I think all of us probably have good views on this. The first thing, on the first question, yes, I think there's no question that more cooperation does increase the prospects that these unilateral policies, once they become more, say, plurilateral, can pass muster before the WTO. The case law interpreting Article 20, which sets out the public policy exceptions, so even something that in theory violates is discriminatory, could be saved by Article 20. And the case law is repeatedly, in a number of cases, focused also on efforts to find multilateral or at least cooperative solutions. And I think this would be this would have ticked that box that at least the EU or the US, Canada, et cetera, try to also discuss with others, with trade partners, to find solutions. And even if in the end they impose it, or impose it in a way that reflects those cooperative understandings, then it improves the chances. On the implicit carbon, I think while I understand and think that we won't get rid of the discussion of whether or not we adjust for non-price policies, that's just a reality in the US, and there's a lot of constituency support for having some kind of border adjustment, even in the absence of explicit carbon pricing. So we probably have to deal with it somehow. And I'm happy to say Aaron and I, we will have a chance to try and do that next year in the research project. But it's clearly risky, because the chances that you choose a methodology that's considered or at least challenged as being arbitrary, doesn't fully consider, there will be so many different ways you could approach it, so many different methodologies, which gives an opponent in a judicial challenge a chance to say, well, we think that you've got the wrong one. This is the right one. Yours is arbitrary. This would be more objective. So without question, it incurs risk.
Does anybody else want to come in on that, or should I move to another question? Seeing no one eager to jump into that fray. We have a question from Ian Williams, who asks how you avoid countries abusing border carbon adjustment as a protectionist instrument as opposed to an instrument of environmental protection. And it's a general question, but if I can frame it, but in the context of cooperation between Canada and the EU, for example, let me frame it by asking: are there elements of the EU CBAM that Canada should be expecting to see or asking to see to ensure that the CBAM treats Canadian imports fairly, or that the US should be asking to see in a Canadian CBAM to ensure that its imports are not unfairly shut out? Does anybody have opinions on what kinds of CBAM design elements we would be talking about to ensure environmental protection as opposed to protectionism?
Yeah, sure. If you let me
Suzanne, please
come in. Yeah, sorry. Sometimes I have connection issues here. Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what I was hinting at. The drafted proposal of the CBAM is really very careful when it comes to double pricing. Yeah, I mean, national treatment means how do you treat this like products in the market they are both in, so the national one and the imported one. And I think the point really comes in when you start calculating this import charge, if you want to call it like that. And if you have free allocation, you need, of course, to reduce the CBAM by this kind of value that, or if you put it on the quantity side of the calculation, you must not double price. That's a discrimination, or overprice and discriminate. And then, of course, you have to treat all countries alike when they deliver to your constituency. And I think so far the drafted proposal is really very clear on the calculation methodology, while of course that is pure theory so far. What we really don't have is, if you want to call it like that, the tax base. So what is the emissions you want to use as the basis for calculating the charge? And that is a bit of a tricky issue, because the easy way out would be to use default values, because we know a lot about average and best available technology values from the sectors in question, while we do not know very much from individual installations outside the EU. We know a lot about the installations in the EU, because the ETS is actually the biggest database you could have when it comes to emissions from output from really every single plant we have. After all, this is all in the registries. Well, we cannot copy and paste that to international production. I mean, let's be clear. But once you start talking about these default values being probably very friendly and very positive in terms of the turnout and the calculation, you get into trouble with these non-discrimination rules. So I think this is something that the proof is still in the eating. But of course, I think I would recommend to have a closer look at what the EU proposal is about and the technical issues. And I think it's a good starting point, but it needs international cooperation also on the data, for sure.
If I may add, oh, sorry.
Yes, please, yes.
Yeah, I was going to just to add on what Susanna was saying, right? When we embarked on this at the very beginning of the EU process, we had to ask a lot of questions, because that's it. Some of the things were not clear, and they were developing as the months went by. Now it's true we have a lot more details right now. There's still a lot of assumptions and things that we need to figure out. But for Canada, of course, our main objective initially was well, get information, do our own calculations as to what we think the impact would be for Canada. But the second thing was to really make sure that the EU would take into consideration our different systems. It was alluded to, different provinces, different measures and all that. And how do you translate that into a national situation? This is Canada's situation vis-a-vis the EU. It is not easy even for us to do. And so our goal was really to make sure that, yes, we can get information, but also we can inform the EU about the current system and situation in Canada.
And if I might come in once more, sorry, I skipped that question, part of the question. I think after all, it's not being ruled out by the EU that you are, as a country that has a more several levels of where you price, you need to agree on how to certify the pricing. So if you want a credit for a carbon price, you don't need to have a national price. Nobody says so. So the proposal doesn't say so. It is just about crediting a carbon price, nothing else, no equivalent, implicit, whatever shadow price. But if you can document that, like with the VAT, that there is a system where you pay something, then this can be solved. So I think the EU is not clear on ruling out any provincial pricing system.
I think that there are a number of aspects of the CBAM that are going to be interesting to watch as it unfolds, and this is certainly one of them. This bilateral negotiation between the EU and its trading partners to decide what the effective carbon price, or the average price, as David put it, will be in terms of crediting for the reduction of the CBAM charge at the border. Super interesting to watch, and one of the answers to the question posed. This has the potential to move the thing in the direction of protectionism or environmental protection. Ken, we haven't heard from you yet, and I'm eager to put a question to you, which is a kind of a hardball question, but I will give you the easy out and ask if there is anything that you've heard up to this point that you would like to respond to instead of taking my hardball question.
I'm happy to take a hardball. Just on this last discussion, I think we're likely to see a lot more bilateral than multilateral discussions, because the individual trading relationships and the individual carbon pricing calculations are probably easier solved initially by doing a bunch of bilaterals before we try and do a multilateral.
Yes, absolutely. Listen, we have a few minutes left, 3 to be exact, before I hand it over to our capable host, but to close up. But Ken, maybe I'll ask you, we're talking here about international cooperation. If we clinically and hypothetically cleave away from international cooperation, if the EU CBAM project implodes, if the US never has a carbon price, does it make any sense for Canada to think about unilaterally proceeding with a border carbon adjustment of its own?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, the actions of the various provinces to protect the competitiveness of their domestic industries is, I don't know if you want to call it a border carbon adjustment, but there's certainly been a lot of work done at the various provinces to make sure their industries remain competitive. And I think that work is going to continue. Alberta is going to continue to export oil and gas, and they're going to want to make sure that those exports are not unfairly sent into the world at a price that makes them uncompetitive. And so that's the perspective that the various provinces are going to take, and whether they view that as a border carbon adjustment or something else, I think is secondary. They're thinking about, as Minister McKenna said, competitiveness really matters. And if we're going to be ahead of the rest of the world in the level of our carbon price, then we're going to have to continue to be worried about our competitiveness. The nice thing is, for the most part, we have a carbon price instead of all of these other policies. We have a bunch of those, and hopefully we can get rid of them. But we have a carbon price, which makes this calculation a little bit easier. I think the challenge for Canada is watching what the US does when they try to impose or calculate some border carbon adjustment or some other adjustment based on policies. And it's hard for, I mean, it's just going to be a bilateral free-for-all, an argument that I think is going to be very hard to resolve unless you have a carbon price.
Thank you, Ken. And again, I'll abuse my position as moderator by saying that Ken and I don't agree on the pessimistic nature of his last judgment, but I don't think we agree on the difficulty of the challenge. Well, let me wrap up that discussion by thanking all of the panelists for really interesting and different insights on the question that I think, as a whole, have shed more light on this thing. There is still more light to be shed. But in closing, let me hand it back to Dave Sawyer to do more thanks and to bring us to an end of the session. Dave.
Great, Aaron. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for that. And thank you in particular, Suzanne, for staying up late into the evening. That was a really interesting discussion, lots to unpack. I really look forward to digging into the video to try and get my head around it a little more. Marie-France, I particularly liked your views on sort of trying to figure out the technocratic, the economic bits while negotiations and policy development are ongoing, right? So you're basically being asked as supporting negotiating positions to do stuff on the fly and make some pretty heroic assumptions about what the implications are. And we have to do this in climate policy a lot, especially when we think about projecting into the future. Michael, thank you for very detail on the U.S. maturations. Just a long and winding road, isn't it? And so it was really good. And Ken, thanks for your insights there. Yeah, our provincial patchwork is a bit of a mess, and each province does their own thing. And I think we're at the point in time now where we have to start aligning systems a little better and cleaning them up. And I think the federal, by deferring to provincial needs and wants, but at the same time, there's effectiveness issues that need to be cleaned up in the system. I want to thank the German Embassy in Canada and Her Excellency in particular for kicking us off. And the German Embassy and the EU have a long history in Canada of being supportive around climate policy. In the dark years of climate policy in Canada, we could count on some of our European friends to keep a light on for us, an intellectual light on, and also sort of catalyze us along as we go. So we're really thankful for your ongoing interest and your patience while we figure out the politics. And then finally, I want to thank the participants for joining us. Thank you for carving out some time and listening to us. We tend to be a little dry at times, so hopefully there was some color in there. Minister McKenna in particular gives us a really good insight on sort of how some of this technical stuff plays out from a more practical political perspective. So that insight there was really, really useful. So I'm going to stop there. And from CICC, I want to thank you all for coming. And please continue to be smart on climate policy. And thank you for the opportunity to share all these thoughts today. So I'll sign off. Thank you.